قول له خلاص.
ايش؟
قول له
مش فاهم. هيبدوا الباوربوينت؟
قول له ابدا.
مين هو؟ مين حيبلش؟
قول له خلاص فتح اللايف.
لا مين اول واحد هيبلش؟ احنا بلشنا؟
ما فتحت فيه.
احنا لازم نبلش
لا انا بلشت نقفل يعني ولا كيف بس؟
لا تكتب بس خليك زي ما احنا.
يمكن ما اتكلم. الميوت الصوت.
Good morning, everyone. I'm glad to be here with you today for this session. Key concepts in bioethics. I think it's very important actually to have a dialogue on the concepts in bioethics. Much of the time, especially for care providers, I'm one of them actually. Want something that's very easy to apply on the ground without looking back actually at the ground, the concepts and where do they come from and what do they mean actually. for us and for the people that we are dealing with. So the philosophical basis for bioethics is very important to consider. Actually, the word use of the people is very important. What do they mean by the terms that they are using? That's very essential as such, because that will give us an idea actually about what we are talking about every time. Many times we might have clashes and conflicts with others simply because we don't understand the terms the same way they do as such. So conceptualization of bioethics is very essential. I won't take much of time. We have 5 distinguished speakers today, and we are starting actually with our first speaker, Dr. Weian. Is that right? Okay. Who's a postdoctoral research fellow from the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and he is speaking on Conscientious. The recognition of medicine. You have a few minutes in order. Then 15 minutes for the Q&A, then the conversation, and I will keep time actually. Let's let we can finish the session. Thank you. Thank you.
Al-Azri. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And my presentation's topic is consensual action as recognition of pluralism in medicine. In the domain of healthcare, it is a matter of debate whether practitioners possess the moral latitude to refrain from offering specific professionally mandated service on the premise that such actions conflict with their deeply held beliefs of conscience. Discussions surrounding consensual action predominantly fall into 3 categories: absolutism, the incompatibility thesis, and the compromise account. Proponents of absolutism assert that practitioners possess an unrestricted right to refrain from providing medical services that conflict with their personal beliefs. Conversely, proponents for the incompatibility thesis argue that the right to consensual action is fundamentally at odds with the professional virtue of prioritizing patients' interests, thereby negating the existence of such a right. Those supporting the compromise account strive to reconcile these opposing viewpoints, persisting that both practitioners' moral integrity and patients' interests hold significant weight. Nevertheless, the literature distinguishes 2 variants of the compromise account of consensual action. The first, which I term the theory of prima facie right to consensual action, persists that the necessary compromise follows the invocation of consensual action. This approach holds that both practitioners' right to consensual action and patients' right to access medical services are initially equally valid and prima facie. When the right to consensual action prevails, it generates moral residues demanding some forms of compensation to the patients, typically in the forms of a referral. The second variant, which I term the theory of all things considered right to consensual action, suggests that the compromise precedes the act of consensual action. This view suggests that practitioners receive explicit guidelines outlining the conditions and limitations for consensual action before they exercise this right, rather than merely fulfilling an obligation to refer the rejected patients. This presentation will challenge both absolutism and incompatibility thesis by distinguishing between virtue-related wrongdoings and impermissible wrongdoings. I argue that while practitioners have no right to commit impermissible wrongdoings, they should be allowed to perform virtue-related wrongdoings. Consensual objections can be seen as virtue-related wrongdoings from patients' perspective when the medical services in question are contentious. First, practitioners should have a right to consensual objection, which lead to the rejection of the incompatibility thesis. Furthermore, when medical services are contentious, objecting practitioners should also view patients' medical requests as virtue-related wrongdoings and should respect patients' right by not impeding their access to treatments elsewhere. This leads to the rejection of the thesis of absolutism. Based on the concept of the right to commit virtue-related wrongdoings, there should be explicit guidelines for consensual objection before practitioners exercise it. Hence, the right to consensual objection should be considered on an all things considered basis rather than prima facie. My oral argument for the right to consensual objection are summarized as follows. Although patients have legal permission to request medical services from practitioners, there may be no decisive moral reason to justify their request under controversial circumstances. It is morally permissible for patients to make these requests and similarly permissible for practitioners to refuse them under controversial circumstances. Of a decisive reason to justify a medical request under controversial circumstances implies that patients should not view practitioners' objection as impermissible wrongdoings, but rather as virtue-related wrongdoings. The practitioners for having the virtue violated by them and blame the practitioners for lacking those virtues. Practitioners are praiseworthy or blameworthy unless they have opportunity to do otherwise. Without a right to consensual objection, leaving them without the opportunity to refuse. First, even if they provide services, their actions are not praiseworthy, leading to inconsistency in the patient's moral judgment. Consequently, there should be a right to consensual objection. First, we need to clarify that just because some medical practices are legal, it does not imply there are decisive moral reasons supporting those practices. In the case of contentious practice, like active euthanasia, their legalization simply means that certain jurisdictions recognize the moral argument in favor of this practice, contrasting with the previous outright rejections. We refer to this as decriminalization. For example, active euthanasia was once equated with homicide, where reasons such as respect for patients' autonomy or beneficence were completely disregarded in public discourse. When countries like the Netherlands or Canada legalized active euthanasia, these reasons were given more weight, and physicians acting on this motivation were no longer subject to punishment. However, the acknowledgement of this reason does not necessarily mean they outweigh opposing arguments, such as those supporting non-maleficence against euthanasia. From a pro-choice perspective, we must respect patients' autonomy and help alleviate intense pain, especially in terminal stage. Conversely, the pro-life perspective might highlight that human life has intrinsic value, given that both pro-choice and pro-life stance have moral justification. Their underlying competing principle often lead to a deadlock, where neither side can persuade the other. This leads to a lack of decisive reason for justifying active euthanasia, while its refutation remains permissible. Secondly, since no reason offers a decisive justification for active euthanasia, yet the pro-choice party still believe it is morally wrong for the pro-life party to hold their position, and vice versa. In such contentious circumstances, the pro-choice view should not consider the pro-life position as impermissibly wrong, but rather as virtue-related wrong. A virtue-related wrong suggests that some behaviors are morally wrong because they fail to reflect the values accepted by certain groups, not because they are generally acknowledged as wrong. For example, from a pro-choice standpoint, consensual objection to active euthanasia is morally wrong because it does not uphold values like respect for patients' autonomy and beneficence, which are not accepted by polite persons in the context of active euthanasia. Therefore, the contentious nature of some medical practice gives rise to the discussion about virtue. Third, when patients praise or blame practitioners for possessing or lacking certain virtues, the basis for such judgment is the opportunity to act otherwise. This opportunity implies that practitioners should retain the freedom to deviate from virtuous expectation. For instance, in a country where active euthanasia is legal but does not permit consensual objection, we cannot truly say that a physician who administers active euthanasia is doing so out of respect for patients' autonomy. It could simply be out of fear of losing their job. Polite individuals might mistakenly praise this physician, believing this physician aligns with their values. To avoid these inconsistent moral judgments, practitioners should enjoy the opportunity not to make virtuous expectation in contentious situations. Since virtues result from habituation, the opportunity to develop or not develop certain virtues are not isolated incidents, but constants. First, in contentious medical practice, this constant opportunity forms the basis for practitioners' right to consensual objection. This line of argument could meet two potential questions. The first concerns balancing practitioners' right to consensual objection with patients' right to access medical services. To address this, we must recognize that patients also have a right to commit what might be considered virtue-related wrongdoings, just as practitioners do. This means that patients have the right to seek medical services elsewhere, even if the objecting practitioners may view it as morally objectionable. Therefore, objecting physicians should not prevent patients from seeking services elsewhere. The second question deals with the power imbalance between practitioners and patients, particularly when patients cannot access medical services elsewhere after encountering consensual objection. One scenario might be a single physician in a rural area who objects to providing certain services, thereby leaving the patients with no alternative. In my view, when there is a significant power imbalance, the practitioner's right to consensual objection should yield to the patient's right. Specifically, if practitioners can foresee that patients will be unable to access legal services elsewhere, they should give up their right to consensual objection. This is because by foreseeing yet refusing to provide legal services like euthanasia or abortion, practitioners are intentionally inflicting harm on their patients. In contrast, patients seeking controversial medical services do so without any intention to harm the practitioner's conscience, even though such requests may indeed cause harm. Ethically, intentional harm is more serious than unintentional harm, demanding that practitioners should prioritize the patient's right. Based on the above analysis, we could summarize three guiding principles for consensual objection. First, the right to consensual objection is not absolute and should apply primarily to morally controversial yet legally sanctioned medical services. Consequently, there are no decisive reason, only virtue-related consideration against the non-provision of such services. Second, possessing a right to commit virtue-related wrongdoings entails a corresponding duty to respect the same right in patients. Therefore, practitioners objecting on consensual grounds must not obstruct patients from seeking controversial medical services elsewhere. Third, practitioners, when they can reasonably foresee that refused patients are unlikely to access controversial medical services through other channels, must prioritize the patient's right and are ethically obliged to provide the required services, even if doing so contravene their personal beliefs. Under this guideline, the right to consensual objection should be considered an all things considered right, rather than merely a prima facie right. Thank you very much for paying attention to my presentation.
Okay, we have time, and we have time for one.
Okay.
They were practicing within a team, actually. It's not in isolation. Not every practitioner is doing it in isolation from the others. So how do you balance that, actually? If I object to some activity in the hospital and the rest of the team is going for it, for example. So how do you make a balance? How do you make a team? Some might object for the activity and others might go for it, actually, from the same team.
Yeah, I think the patient just seek the medical service from the who agreed to provide the services. It does not influence the patient the right to access medical service. Yeah, because someone unwilling to the patient go out and find the medical services from other channels. Thank you very much.
So, our next speaker is Naz Gün. I'm pronouncing it right. Gün. Okay, so Naz Gün, she had her basic studies in Zhong, and then she works for several international organizations, actually, and now she's pursuing her PhD degree in bioethics, and she'll be speaking about the very interesting topic, actually, the kind of management of
So let me just try to see this. So hello, everyone. The question is on chimeric embryos. So first of all, there are not transgenic embryos. Transgenic embryos are embryos within which sequences of foreign DNA were added. So there was no DNA. But I will focus on the chimeric embryo. So here the DNA sequence was not modified, but the organism contains cells of different. In the very early stages of the animal embryo. And then there are also zygotes, which are embryos created with the introduction of to an animal oocyte. So this is an example of a research that was led in 2021, where human pluripotent cells were introduced in a monkey's blastocytes, and this created the first human monkey embryo. So I will talk a bit more about this in the next. Yeah. So I work on French law primarily, so this is why I developed this a bit more, but I will also talk about the other countries. So in France, there was a strict for chimeric embryos until 2021, and the reason was to put a limit. This was mostly motivated by moral, religious. There was a new law that was being in debate in the technologies that were emerging. This was too restrictive. So in the law of 2021, the Code of Public Health was modified, and now the modification of a human embryo, a junction of cells coming from other cells. It should be noted that before the same now it's not as clear. The only animal cells in a human embryo, but then this means that now you can put human cells in an animal's embryo. So the country is now authorized. The law nonetheless affirms that an embryo research has been carried should not be implemented in a euthanasia. So these practices have been justified by the French National Institute of Health and Medical Research for the possibility they offer to develop new animal models of human pathologies in order to carry research on these organisms. So France is really not the only one to be in this situation. France is actually quite late. The first country to authorize primary research was United Kingdom, the Human Fertilization and Embryology Act in 2008. So they're the first country in the world to legally authorize it. There might have been research led on this before, but there wasn't a law on this before. So the United Kingdom officially recognized it. But it's not written in the slide, but the United Kingdom is similar to France, where the introduction of human cells in animal embryo is authorized, but not the contrary. And this is the case in most countries. The USA, on the other side, actually only says in a law that was enacted in 2021 that you cannot put chimeric embryos in whether it's animal or human. But this law doesn't precise what type of chimeric embryo you're able to conceive. So actually, it does not overtly forbid the introduction of animal cells into a human embryo. So we could understand from that it is actually perfect. Belgium, on the other hand, it's a strict no. It's no matter where the cell comes from, no matter what the embryo is, you cannot. It's forbidden. That's Belgium. Australia and Canada are like in the United Kingdom and France, in both countries. So it's the same principle where you are authorized to put human cells in an animal embryo, but not the contrary. So no animal cells in a human embryo. So in Australia, it's the Prohibition of Human Cloning for Reproduction Act of 2002, and in Canada, this is in the Assisted Human Reproduction Act of 2004. And lastly, Germany, it's like Belgium, it's a strict no. It's no matter where the cell comes from, no matter where the embryo comes from, this cannot create any transgenic or chimeric embryos. Well, people have been experimenting around this. In 2007, and in 2018, so the findings of these were presented at the annual meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which was in Austin. But the problem with the pork and sheep chimeric embryos is that it didn't survive. They tried the manipulation, but it didn't survive. But in 2021, for the first time, the first viable chimeric, and it was a chimeric man that was able to live for 21 days. But they had to destruct it at the end of the 21st day. This was led by a team of Chinese. Now, I just wanted to point that of chimeric embryos, but it's not special. Since the late 1990s, about the human embryo's dignity destroyed at the derivation process, and arguments for and against embryonic stem cell research were published in the 20s already, after President George Bush acted to significantly limit federal funding for the research. So what I'm trying to say is that there is a set of controversies around the creation of the research on the human embryos, but not added layer of concerns around the creation of animal human embryos. So I chose to focus this presentation on the Catholic perspective, but of course there's a very rich faith-based literature on the subject of creation of chimeric embryos, whether it's the Hindu perspective, the Islamic perspective, the Orthodox perspective. But for this presentation, I will mostly focus on the Catholic doctrine. So there are many authors and scholars who actually agree that there's of systematic theology. And I will also dwell on actually the benefits of creating human animal embryos and what it can, why it can be beneficial for research. But nevertheless, most of theology that the creation of chimeric embryos blur the distinction. And in the Bible, in the book of Genesis, there's a tripartite order in the world, which distinguishes plants, animals, and humans. And only the humans are created in the image of God. So in the book of Genesis, it says, "Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the bird in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals and all." And in the image of God, He created them. So, well, the Pontifical Academy for Life, the Catholic, and the Pontifical Council for Health, are both institutions that are in the Vatican. I will not enter into the details of their authorities, but both have widely, really strongly disapproved Bishop Elias Creccia. He said this is monstrous, violating the most, like this violation that there can be. And the Catholic, the Pontifical Council of Health did say human genes embody the characteristic uniqueness of the person, which medicine is bound to protect. And then the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, which is the jurisdiction of the Pope, also condemned this principle. And yeah, I will just focus on the fact that it's, from the ethical standpoint, such procedures represent an offense against the dignity of human beings, of human and animal genetic elements capable of disrupting the specific identity of man. So there are arguments against the creation of impulsiveness, violation of human dignity, moral status of human animal creatures capable of independence, and the mixing and animal genetic material risks creating new diseases. But then there are also, and this is my final slide, arguments in favor, which can alleviate human suffering by enhancing research. I won't have the time to dwell into. It is really a promising material for methods against cures against Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease, basically. And since the embryo was not produced by human fertilization, it cannot be regarded. If research is accepted on human embryos up to 14 days, then why not chimeric embryos? And then finally, neither human nor animal are violated, since the embryo will never be allowed to become a human and an animal. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm wondering what the Catholic Church about other animal products that are inserted into humans. So, for instance, pig baths that are inserted into humans, because that might be seen as also violated.
It's true. Actually, there was a word for this. This is chimeric organisms. It does exist, or pig dog is exactly fitting the size of the human's hearts. It does. It raises less controversy in the doctrine. There are some of embryos, because with the problem. So the problem here is about the dignity also of the human embryo, and whether are we going to destroy it or not destroy it. So I think this is why this raises more controversy among the Christian doctrine. Rather, like when you insert a part of an animal into the human body, you are not creating a new living being.
It's very interesting and stimulating, yes. One last question.
Yes. Okay. Good. Hi. That was very, very interesting. I'm a nephrologist, and right now, frontier is really xenotransplantation, as you know. And we are, in order to make it happen, you have to introduce some or remove some genetic material from the pig and insert something similar to the human. So crossing that boundary, we know that the first person died, was just recently, transplanted at HMS at Harvard, and he died, and the other one just recently had the organ removed. But in an era where there are just so few organs and so many people who have end-stage kidney, how is this going to happen, and what are the thoughts?
So the thing is, in chimeric organisms or transplantation, it's not the same thing as chimeras, because here again we don't create a third organ from one and put it in the. What I read, this does not raise as much controversy in the doctrine. Nevertheless, and this is also why they want to create chimeric embryos, is when you create, one day, chimeric embryos are allowed to grow and become fully developed, potentially a bank for donors. Like you could potentially take some elements of this fully grown creature and this is something that is actually research. It could be a very good bank actually to produce. There's a shortage. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Naz, for this interesting discussion. Actually, it could go on for hours and days, even as such. Our next speaker is Dr. Chung, Associate Professor from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. He's a social epidemiologist and group research in equity with particular interest in vulnerable populations.
This is me.
Chung, the next or
This is me. What's your name again?
Roger Chung. Yeah, that's my PowerPoint. Thank you very much for having me here. It's my privilege as the co-director of the Center for Bioethics of the Chinese University of Hong Kong to present to you my ongoing study, which is a scope and review on the attitudes towards end-of-life interventions in Asia, with particular interest in active, passive euthanasia and also physician-assisted dying. So just a little bit of background, because this is a session on key concepts of bioethics, so I decided to make this slide over here on euthanasia. It came from the Greek word of good death, with a modern meaning of intentionally ending life or death hastening to limit suffering. And we can think of it based on these different categories: active, passive, and physician-assisted suicide, or otherwise known as medical aided dying or physician-assisted dying and whatnot. And then you can also categorize them based on their voluntariness, voluntary, non-voluntary, and involuntary. Now, of course, it provokes intense ethical debate still doing so, and increasingly entering the legal and political arenas at the same time. And this is just a snapshot of legal status of euthanasia around the world. And as you can see, the blue here are the parts of the world that active voluntary euthanasia is legal. And then in light blue, passive euthanasia are actually illegal, meaning refusal of treatment and life-sustaining support. And in gray, those are the parts that active euthanasia is illegal, but passive euthanasia is not really regulated or legislated against. And then we have the parts in red, where all forms of euthanasia is actually ruled to be illegal. For PAS, on the other hand, much less part is actually legal in blue, and then in light blue is legalized by court ruling, but not really legislated or regulated. And then in gray are basically where physician suicide is not really legal around the world. So in Asia, AE and PAS generally remain to be illegal in all Asian countries, but
passive euthanasia are permitted in some countries. And Japan is a special case where they actually have a tentative legal framework for euthanasia, but it has faced strong opposition from the public. So active and passive euthanasia are conditional, right? So they're not legal or illegal, but again, they face strong opposition from the public. So it's not really progressing from that onwards. So about the literature, there's a significant body of research on attitudes toward euthanasia, of course, in the West, with growing support for euthanasia in many parts of the world in the West. And recent research has also begun to shift the focus away from general towards more specific conditions related approval, like psychiatric disorders, dementia, or tiredness of life. In contrast, there's comparative positive reviews from Asia, with only a systematic review by Chung et al. In 2018 that included 17 studies only, with no English version available, and also a systematic review by Martina et al. In 2021 that looked at healthcare professionals' views on advanced care planning, but not on euthanasia per se. So here's the study objective, is to conduct a scoping review of available literature on attitudes towards end-of-life interventions, including active, passive, and also PAS within Asia, for the purpose of comparing trends and patterns of the attitudes towards these different practices, and thereby identifying gaps in the literature for future research. So here's my methods briefly. We followed terms of these three mnemonic population, where all Asian populations are grouped according to characteristics such as healthcare specialists, students, patients, and also the general public. Concept includes, again, passive, active euthanasia, assisted dying, suicide, death, hastened death and dying, medical aid assisted in dying, death with dignity, withholding and withdrawal of life-sustaining, life-prolonging treatments. And a note over there is that involuntary euthanasia was not considered in this review, as it is usually regarded as homicide or manslaughter. And the context is all countries in Asia. Here's the eligibility criteria. All peer-reviewed primary empirical research studies, they are all quantitative or qualitative, and from 2000 onwards, the year 2000 onwards, because we want to maximize relevance. Exclusion criteria include papers written in a language other than English, opinion pieces, legal commentaries, literature reviews that were not empirical, animal euthanasia, euthanasia within pediatric populations, studies outside of Asia, study focusing on palliative care or advanced care planning only, and also studies on palliative or terminal sedation only. They're all excluded. So these are the databases that we've used and also the search terms that we have used. Okay, so here are some of the results. So this is the Prisma diagram, flow diagram. We start off with 2,000 plus papers, and then went through filtering out and removing the duplicates, and also excluding papers based on the title and abstract. And we ended up with 214 full-text articles qualified for eligibility. And then we also then excluded about 105 articles based on, again, duplicates and also relevance, non-relevance towards the research question, you know, like papers that did not examine attitudes of euthanasia as a primary focus. Then we ended up with 109 studies included in the final review. Among these 109 studies, we have 99 quantitative studies, predominantly using cross-sectional surveys, 9 qualitative interviews, focus groups, ethnography or hermeneutic approach, and 1 mixed methods study. The sample sizes ranges from 30 to 3,380, which is a huge range for quantitative studies, 6 to 35 for qualitative studies. 79 studies are on passive euthanasia, followed by AE, active euthanasia, with 54. and then 16 on PAS, which is a lot less, a lot fewer studies, and also 11 on undefined euthanasia. For country representation, we have about 1 to 16 studies per country. Hong Kong, where I came from, had the most studies at 16. And more studies are generally in East Asia versus South Asia, Southeast Asia, or Middle East. All right, so these are the countries that are covered in the review. As you can see, most of them have all forms of euthanasia being illegal, but with the exception of Hong Kong, India, Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, Israel, and also Thailand, passive euthanasia is actually legalized over there. And with Japan having no official law, but a tentative framework for legalization that is facing opposition. I understand that this slide is the texts are quite small. I'm just gonna highlight some of the stuff. As you can see, the green numbers are the approval rate, while the red numbers are actually disapproval. So you can see that generally speaking, there is the lowest acceptance rate in Muslim Middle East from 9.6% to 39%. But higher acceptance rate for passive euthanasia that we're talking about here in East Asia, ranging from 61% to 98.9%. There's a lot of consensus, broad consensus for terminally ill patients, autonomy to decline life-sustaining treatments to alleviate suffering among the East Asian countries. And as you can see, those numbers are very consistently almost around 90%. There's some discrepancies. Specifically, patients are more willing to forego life-sustaining treatments than their caregivers, who tend to opt for more aggressive measures. And then among the healthcare professionals and healthcare students, healthcare-related students, there are some varying attitudes of doctors towards euthanasia, depending on their specialty training and experience in delivering end-of-life care. They found that psychiatrists, an Indian study actually found that psychiatrists and intensive care doctors are more supportive of the practice than oncologists or hematologists. There's also a higher acceptance of withholding, that is not starting the life-sustaining treatments, than withdrawing, that is like when you start it, you stop giving the life-sustaining treatments in many of the places in Asia. And then in East Asia, there's greater acceptance of limiting futile LST and prioritizing comfort over prolonging the life, prolonging the dying process among the general public. However, in Middle East and also in South Asia, there's very limited research on public perspectives, which is a research gap for those areas. 2 minutes, right? Okay. For active euthanasia, I'm not gonna read those numbers anymore. But overall acceptance are relatively lower than withdrawing and withholding LST, as you would expect it. There's also diversity in views across subpopulations. So for public, there is some public support. I wouldn't say that they are low percentage per se. They're over 50% in many of these places that are highlighted over here. There's also generally a lower acceptance among the healthcare professionals than the general public. And medical students are generally also more accepting of active euthanasia than their healthcare professionals counterpart. And I would say that there's still a considerable number of health professionals that also support active euthanasia among these countries. I think the interesting part is Israel has very high acceptance rate for active euthanasia among the countries in the Middle East. For PAS, there's generally lower general knowledge, so the acceptance levels are also relatively lower among all these different regions. These are the results for the qualitative studies. I still have just a couple of slides. 1 minute, okay. I think I'm gonna skip this slide, okay? So basically it's saying that it's complex, it's contextual, it can change, it's a complex process. family involvements can exceed sometimes physician input in end-of-life decisions, and also there are practical considerations around old age and burden that shape the acceptance of these practice. I'm going to skip this one also. Here's some implications. So active euthanasia is not completely unwelcomed in Asian countries and societies. In fact, there's a general trend of high or even increasing approval of active euthanasia in some Asian countries. Religion and culture plays a key part to the rate of approval or disapproval. So therefore, we should pay attention to the change of attitudes towards the different forms of euthanasia in the future. And in the future, we should try to solicit views of different stakeholders to identify key factors in approval of different forms of euthanasia using qualitative method, and also in countries that have not really done these kind of research. Here are some limitations: publication bias, uneven representation of countries, inconsistency sometimes in the wording of the key questions, and also limited assessment of the study quality using scoping review methodology. Okay, this is my last slide. So we should not generalize the attitudes towards euthanasia for all Asian countries as one entity. It's highly contextual, and I think that this review served as a valuable starting point for gaining insights into this diverse perspectives on end-of-life care in Asia. Thank you very much. Okay.
Other factors like gender or education associated?
They are involved. But I would say that it quite consistently, religion or social cultural factors seems to be the stronger factors than those other socioeconomic or gender related factors. Yeah. Thank you. Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, this is missing from the literature, and that would be very interesting to do in Asia. Yeah, thank you. All right, thank you. Thank you for being here.
Hello, everyone. We come back to informed consent. That's a problem that it's still important for medicine, for not only in euthanasia but also in involuntary mission in the psychiatric hospital. The central ethical problem of our presentation is the valid consent from the perspective of theory of international human rights law, because we will present a case, Atudore versus Romania. It's a case that was judged in European Court of Human Rights. But first, in the context of literature, the concept of valid consent is accredited instead of informed consent. Sometimes informed consent is changed with valid consent for legal perspectives, because in the case of involuntary admission, for instance, the full informed consent cannot be provided, but a valid consent should be provided. So the case study then we start is Atudore versus Romania. That was a case that was presented in the European Court of Human Rights and was referred of the case of involuntary psychiatric hospitalization. More specifically, it was a person that was institutionalized by her family with accord with the doctors in the context that she was practicing, she was an adept of a new religious movement, one movement that was involved yoga practice that was considered a sect in Romania at 2004. So this was the motive that they try to intake the patient, and the parents wants to remove this person from the influence of this yoga movement, from this spiritual movement. She was not agree, but in that period in Romania there was a big scandal with this yoga movement. Was notorious that this movement have brainwashed their adepts, and they were considered that this person cannot have a valid consent because her autonomy was limited by the practicing of this sects, or the practice of this Asian Indian type of yoga, and they say she was under influence, under maleficent influence of a guru, so she cannot have a valid consent. So well, they called into questions the basic reason for hospitalization, the plain if really developed the mental disorder, because she was she testified in front of the court that she was followed by very strictly by her family, starting from her childhood, not only after she was practicing yoga, but also before. She was somehow linked with her family. She was very constrict, and the parents have an abusive behavior, and there was a problem. The court to testify that we cannot know if the practicing of yoga could put her in the situation of not have a real judgment, a real balance in judgment, so cannot consent. But if the childhood make her her presence, and she wants to escape from her families and from her influence. So the moment when she was institutionalized was when she wants to marry with her fiancé that was part of the same spiritual movement, and for preventing this marriage, the family decides to institutionalize, and the Human Rights Court considered that she still have even she has a diminished capacity because in this anti-sect movement, they say often that the capacity to consent is diminished, and the gurus and or the leader of the cult have a maleficent influence on that person. But in this situation, the European Court says, okay, but she still has a right to have civil rights to marriage or to practice religion, even have a diminished capacity, even. But this diminished capacity was never proved or attested by medical test, by psychiatric evaluation, at least by 2 psychiatric evaluations. It was only 1 psychiatric evaluation. The one was made in internment, but not confirmed by another psychiatrist after that. So, from our bioethical point of view, informed consent can be valid even if it's not complete, and that is the patient did not have access to all available information, but only to those the doctor considered the patient competent to understand. The consent is valid if it is fully informed, but not only if it is fully informed, but if communicate the problem and in the language that the patient understand, or the language that can understand, and if she was taken out for a limited period from this spiritual movement and take out from influence of this sect, she can consent. Of course, the valid consent can be altered by the psychical state in the case of a treatment, or in the case of actual disease that is invalidating for mental capacity. But this should not limit her capacity to overtake the decision about her state of health and or her state of freedom, or voluntary or involuntary admission in the hospitals. So when a person that have, for instance, a stroke, when a person have a stroke, one member of the family should also consent about the treatment, or about withdrawal of the treatment. So there is a situation when this voluntary consent or could be limited, but this limitation should be made in such way that the basic human right should not be altered. There are a number of elements that make informed consent invalid: coercion, fraud, or manipulation, as long as the moral norm is only idealized, not having the constraint force of the legal norm. In its application represents a pure virtue. So this norm of informed consent should be transformed from a simple bioethical norm to the legal, to enforce by the legal practice, by the legal representation. Ethics based on justice and equity, because it's benefit from normative transposition codified by law, has a punitive force, and as such represent a behavior adopted and imposed as a society level. So thank you very much. This was my presentation.
manipulate as well that concept of consent to fit within that structure. Thank you very much. So our last speaker for this session. Right now, she has established, she's the founding actually head of the Bioethics department at Shalimar Medical and Dental College in Pakistan, and she had
Thank you so much. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum and good morning, everybody. Thank you for the introduction. I'll talk in today's, my plan is to talk about, I'll share a case from my clinical practice as a pediatrician in Pakistan. And the situation actually kind of raised a couple of questions. So I'll kind of analyze those questions and then I will briefly discuss the philosophical background of autonomy and paternalism, because based on those questions, and I will propose a new concept of consensual paternalism and introduce that and its application of how we can use that concept in shared decision making. So I'll begin with the case. So I encountered in my clinical practice, I encountered an 8-year-old child who suffered an accidental drowning incident, and he was found after 10 minutes by his peers. He was in water, submerged in water. He was taken out. The ambulance took another 10 to 15 minutes to come. So CPR was delayed for another 10-15 minutes. And when he was brought to our emergency department, he had no pulse or breathing. And so a vigorous CPR was started. And almost after 30 minutes, the spontaneous return of circulation was established. So the child was intubated and shifted to ICU. The parents were obviously, they were in a very difficult position because the child who was, playing around, active, healthy, like in moments before the incident, now he was in a pediatric ICU, dependent on a ventilator, a machine breathing for him. So we had several care meetings after 10 days of aggressive clinical management and several case consultations. It was very clear that Ahmed had suffered a severe anoxic irreversible brain injury. And it was also apparent that the parents were struggling to make a decision about withdrawal of support. At that point, nothing that we said or did was very useful for them. I was at that point in time, I was sitting with them for almost an hour. There was long silence in the room, and it was broken by father's crying voice. And he asked very clearly, he asked, "What should we do, doctor?" So this question, "What should we do, doctor?" in my humble practice as a clinician and a bioethicist and some experience in the West as well, I realized that this is the one question that often parents ask from pediatricians or care providers in non-Western societies. In the West, in the US and UK, I've seen that they ask the pediatricians, what would you do if this was your child? So I see that there are two different questions. They pose different challenges and that's what I'm going to talk about, autonomy and paternalism based on these questions, because the first question that's very common in the West, it talks about autonomy of the person who will be making a decision for their own child. But in the second question that we often face, there's a sort of a paternalism, accepted paternalism by the family members. So I'll briefly talk about the philosophical concepts of autonomy and paternalism. Respect for autonomy is a vital constituent of Western bioethics, and Immanuel Kant shared this concept of autonomy of will. And according to him, will is of a person who can reason, reflect, and debate. So for Kant, rationality is the foundation source of autonomy. In contemporary bioethics, autonomy is described as one of the 4 principles by Bishop and Childress, and it's who can act freely in accordance to self-chosen path. That person is an autonomous person. The Western principle of autonomy is applied globally, yet the practical application and significance, it may vary due to social and cultural concepts. So Kara notes that if autonomy is described as a universal principle, there ought to be different versions according to the context. A person's nature and character of self are reflected in their autonomy. So actions are free to a degree that they are consistent with one's self-identity, but dependence is a human feature, and their choices are bound to their social, cultural, and religious contexts. So for paternalism, I'll just go very briefly about it. So autonomy and paternalism, they are considered 2 extreme ends of the spectrum of decision-making. Paternalism is considered an obstruction of a person's rights against their will, claiming that the obstruction is for welfare of that patient or to protect them from harm. I make an argument for paternalism that is inherent in several cultures and societies like Pakistan, many non-Western societies, especially in Asia. This culture is representative of many other social structures where there is a socially informed acceptability for paternalism. So Kant's description of autonomy that is talked about is widely discussed in contemporary bioethics, but here I'm going to use a German philosopher Adorno's critique of Kant's autonomy to argue for my concept of consensual paternalism. To build a case for consensual paternalism, we need to think of a compassionate and empathetic patient-provider relationship for clinical decision-making, where patients autonomously sanction the provider to make a moral judgment. I argue that Adorno's philosophy presents a critical approach to Kant that can help us conceptualize or maybe reconceptualize autonomy that can be applied not only in traditionally paternalistic societies and cultures, but also in morally and culturally pluralistic societies. So globally, it can be applied. Adorno confronts the fundamental concepts of Kantian autonomy. For Kant, rationality is the basis of autonomy, but for Adorno adds human emotions and instincts to rationality to establish autonomy. For Kant, autonomy and freedom are antithetical to human nature, but for Adorno claims reflective part of human nature as the basis of autonomy. So reflection, emotions. So Adorno concludes that society not only influences our cognitive abilities, but also our social and emotional needs, which according to Adorno are social prerequisites of autonomy. The autonomous agent therefore may decide not to make an explicit decision. Their autonomy would still be uncompromised if it's shaped by their cultural practices to hand over the responsibility of making those tough choices, which may even not be a choice because of their social, economic, or other constraints, like in the case of my patient whose families was very financially not able to take care of the child at home, having a home ventilator and stuff like that. Parents in my narrative also ceded the right to make an autonomous decision. The decision was there, but whether we see this as autonomous act now depends on our view of which kind of view of autonomy we like to prefer. Rationality coupled with reflective emotions and lived experiences, this represents Adorno's autonomy. Autonomy and paternalism are dynamic entities that for reasoning and reflection to be incorporated into active process of decision making. The same happened with Ahmed's parents. The question his father asked me, I gave them my recommendations. I told them that the child was dying and we will try our best to keep him comfortable. They cried, they nodded, they thanked me even. And that evening, the family said goodbye to the child. This is what I call consensual paternalism. This concept, talking about these 2 questions again, so there is a concept of autonomy, but then there is an aspect of paternalism as well. So So this concept does not threaten the values or principles that are, can you please move this forward? I don't know. Okay, thank you. All right, so this concept does not threaten the values or principles that are substantially significant to patient-provider relationship and decision-making. Rather, it promotes both of the principles of autonomy and paternalism. This concept does not support or encourage, obviously, any illegitimate authority or coercion by healthcare providers. Rather, it envisages a facilitative and collaborative role in clinical decision-making. Patients and families often expect their providers to act like friend or a teacher, as you know, as written in a paper by Emmanuel, to help them guide to make a decision. And this is not limited only to non-Western societies. So we know that even in the West, healthcare providers, they justifiably nudge patients like in a certain direction. They use negative framing, prospect theory, etc. Use consensuous objection. So all of these things are part of how healthcare providers act as a moral agent themselves. So for consensual paternalism, the patients are engaging in accepting these decisions. So I assume fair conversations in good faith by healthcare providers, respecting the decision-making prerogative, and then promoting beneficence and avoiding harm. So, but through concept of consensual paternalism, I'm kind of providing healthcare providers a space where they can safely make just moral decisions for the patients and the families. Thank you so much.
No, paternalism, no consent disease. So there is no space for against one's consent.
But for an autonomous decision, we assume, like say for an informed consent, we assume that the person or the patient or a parent, they are able to convey their wishes as well. So as a part of an informed consent. So at least in Pakistan, when we make such decisions of like withdrawing life support, we make them sign an informed consent to ensure that they know, they understand, they can reason it, and they are able to convey their choices. Now, the only situation that's happening here is, and this is sometimes very challenging for healthcare providers in the West, to kind of envision that a person or a parent, they are not making a decision because it's a hard choice. They want somebody else to, kind of make that decision. And this is in our cultural practices of like non-Western societies, Asian society, many a times the patients, they come, at least in Pakistan, we've seen that they come and they say that above there's God and here it's you, so you make the decision. So it's healthcare providers' responsibility to ensure that they still ensure that the family or the patient, they know everything. However, if they are unable to actually communicate their wishes like verbally, probably, then the healthcare providers may, step up, make a hard decision for them, which might seem paternalistic in many cultures and societies, because parents are not explicitly making this choice. So I'm trying to make a space where we don't call it paternalism, because as you said, that is not actually paternalism. However, it's still not the kind of autonomy that we talk about in contemporary bioethics. So that's why I brought this Western German philosophers' concept of autonomy, which talks about how emotions and instincts and societal impressions help us develop our. So thank you for your comment.
to it. Just wondering if you have ever considered the way we conceptualize autonomy instead. So here in this case, the patient is actually some way, right? So sounds to me that that is what I'm understanding.
Yeah, thank you. So I think basically what I was actually thinking about was how to introduce autonomy as we see it in our clinical practice and in our society and culture. And it is in some way, some form of autonomy. And that's why I'm trying to bring those things together. Like in some ways, it is a form of autonomous decision-making. And in some ways, it's somewhat paternalistic as well. But there is this space on the continuum of decision making, like here's autonomy, here's paternalism. We always take these two entities like as total opposites. But I'm trying to show that this is a spectrum where we make decisions and we do make them. So like, just like I said, like there are so many examples, especially thinking about COVID and all. So there even in Western societies, we do make clinical decisions on that spectrum. So I'm just trying to kind of think of maybe like there is some space on that spectrum where both are actually meeting. So we're sort of trying to redefine or maybe reconceptualize the concept of autonomy that we.
I'm asking, this is very similar to Chinese culture. I talk to a lot of Asians families or Asians, and they say, this is my autonomy. Yeah. My autonomy is to give you to decide for me. That's my autonomy.
Right.
And why are you not saying that that's not my autonomy?
Yeah.
There's some similarity.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. The same happens in Pakistan and other cultures as well. But sometimes it's more challenging when they're not explicitly saying that I let you make the decision, right? So sometimes that's also a situation where they don't want to make that hard decision, especially, and like I'm talking about pediatrics based on my experience, but I've seen that especially making decisions for their parents who are very old, the end of life decisions, they don't want to make that tough choice because they don't want to live with that, the burden of that decision. And we have to allow, to them to, okay, just let go of that burden. I'm making that decision for you, and like you can be at peace with that decision. Great, thank you so much. Thank you.
Whereas they don't want to make the decision that leaders in the society, social leaders, or religious leaders, or even the of some kind at that point in time. But again, the concept of autonomy is very culture specific. Their own, without any interference. For polytheistic societies, actually, the person cannot do it alone. They feel very stressed, actually, and overburdened if they want to make a decision, especially for critical care. To be touched on the philosophy foundation of some bioethical, very important and very vital. Much of the time we are spending actually on the ground ethics, actually what is applicable at the ground level. We need to go back to the concepts, things, think about them and how they are changing over time as well. concepts and how they apply to society. And when we talk about bioethics in particular, we don't want to enforce these concepts on patients. If they have different worldviews, they have different conceptualization. We need to understand what they are looking for, actually, so we can. I don't know if you have any comments, any questions, any points to raise, or any decision.
In your presentation, in one of the slides, life support, do you think it's
Okay, by definition, yeah.
diverse opinion on that?
Right, of course.
It's a bit technical. Whether
Well, okay, so I was just saying what the terminology means. I think this is very similar to the situation here in Hong Kong. Because they would avoid using the word euthanasia, or even not even using the word passive euthanasia to once you know people feel comfortable, it's much easier to sort of practice that you think is that. Hong Kong, withdrawing and withholding licensing treatments are actually permissible.
In my country, Oman, for example, we can withdraw life support. Actually, if it's no longer, so the why is different. You might want
or by commission, that's clear that euthanasia is not allowed, whereas passive euthanasia, not euthanasia by commission. I'm more confused in that is the combined, but when you are saying an act of affirmation or commission, when that it's always an act of willing, wanting to end the life, right? So what about passive euthanasia?
In the same morning session in 30. This was recorded, right? This is recorded.
Yeah.
Is it possible to access the record as a participant or even only my section? Okay. I have a presentation tomorrow in the same room at 8:30.
Yes.
And I need to submit my PowerPoint presentation for this.
Okay. It's already here.
No, it's not there.
Okay. Do you have USB? You have it. You have it in.
Internet. Yeah. So
You have
if
it in your
email
phone?
ID, I can email you that. Is that okay?
You can send it by WhatsApp. It's better.
Okay.
Okay.
So give me your number then.
77. Is this a category number?
No.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm doing WhatsApp to you.
Okay.
Your name, please.
KANAAN.
KANAAN.
Canal.